I want to offer you a way of understanding China and a very different way of viewing its current leadership from what we usually read. China's a latecomer in a group of Asian miracle economies. It experiences many of the same ups and downs as South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. And now it faces a turning point shared by all the Asian miracle economies that I call a crisis of success. These crises of success are caused by complexity. You start with fairly simple economy and simplified politics, and economic success creates an incredibly differentiated society. And you cannot manage that complex economy out of the president's office the way you can an economy of landlords, peasants, road builders, and cheap socks manufacturers. And likewise, politics becomes very complicated. Though a crisis of success is a moment in the development of a business or a country where complexity forces an organizational transformation. Think of an entrepreneur who invents a really cool widget, and that business just takes off. It's managed by the entrepreneur personally with an entourage. And then if you're really successful entrepreneur or really successful Asian miracle economy, you suddenly hit a point where, in the case of the entrepreneur, you need more capital. You got to list on the stock exchange. You got to have really professional accounting and human resources. And you have to have a board of directors and a public rule book. And you either make it through that Elon Musk moment or you don't. Xi Jinping's job is to manage China's Elon Musk moment. For countries, these crises of success share certain characteristics. Like South Korea and Taiwan in the 1980s, China finds itself over-leveraged, threatened by debt, bubbles, and bankruptcies. The big companies find themselves heavily indebted and unprofitable. Politics also grows more complex. You have a lot more demonstrations. You have huge interest groups trying to take control of certain areas of policy. How has China's crisis of success emerged? Let's start back with Zhu Rongji, who was in charge of the economy from 1994 to 2003. He was the ultimate market reformer. In his desperate effort to save the banks and the big companies from collapse, he had to move 45 million manufacturing workers into service jobs. Remember what happened to this country when we moved 3 million people out of manufacturing jobs? He decided to cut the Chinese government in half. And at the top levels, he largely succeeded. Can you imagine if Ronald Reagan had stood up and said, I'm going to cut the US government in half? The reaction would have been overwhelming. It's a lot harder to cut the Chinese government in half. This was enormously stressful. Initially, the people accepted the social stress because they were afraid the place was going to collapse. But with success, by 2001, 2002, Chinese society was just stressed out. People were saying, we're just not going to take it anymore. And so you got a new leadership under Hu Jintao, where the slogan was, harmonious society. Harmonious society had deep philosophical underpinnings, but in practice it meant no more Zhurongji market reforms. The government and party nearly doubled under Hu after Zhurongji had tried to cut it in half. Hu was a very weak leader. He was personally crippled by diabetes. His team of 9 Politburo Standing Committee members worked by majority vote. We have an institution that has 9 senior people that works by majority vote called the Supreme Court. Very judicious, not very fast. That was Hu Jintao's experience. And the older leaders kept interfering and blocking even the policies that Hu Jintao tried to pursue. Economic and political reform largely stopped. They found that ministers weren't listening to the prime minister. Local governments weren't listening to the center. Corruption went through the roof. The military was obsessively focused with making money for the top generals, not with learning how to shoot straight. Demonstrations increased from 20,000 per year to 180,000 per year before they stopped publishing the statistics. Powerful interest groups were asserting authority over policy. What do I mean by powerful interest group? Well, the petroleum faction controlled the flow of energy resources through China. That's hundreds of billions of dollars. And there was a market price, an official price, which they arbitraged and put a lot of the difference in their pockets. The head of the petroleum faction, Zhou Yangkang, was one of the 9 members of the leadership, the Politburo Standing Committee. And he happened to be China's chief of security. That's a strong interest group. That makes the NRA look like a little puppy dog. This combination of economic and political issues is China's crisis of success. The leaders had to restart economic reform, and they had to reassert central authority. On economics, they worked with the World Bank, with Nobel Prize winners like Mike Spence, with an amazing range of talent to develop a plan based on market allocation of resources. If the economy is too complicated to manage from an office in the central city, you let the market make a lot of the decisions. It made a lot of sense. Seldom in world history has an economic plan been so carefully prepared. Politically, they saw the challenges as requiring drastic centralization. So instead of having 9 members in the leadership, they had 7. And they took the extremes of opinion and left them out so it would be easier to reach consensus. They decided the new guy would get immediate control of the military, whereas Hu Jintao had to wait 2 years. They created a National Security Council to coordinate military and foreign policy the first time, and a bunch of what they call small leading groups to take charge of everything from financial reform to Taiwan policy to military reform. And they put one guy in charge of all those. This is real centralization. And these were consensus decisions, separate from the choice of Xi Jinping as the guy who was going to get these roles. Immediately, the problems began. If the market was going to allocate resources, then political and state enterprise groups were not, party groups. And they were unhappy about that. If the market were put in charge, then the state enterprises would be squeezed, and that meant the banks would be squeezed, because the state enterprises can only pay back the banks through their special privileges. They don't earn enough to make their cost of capital. Military reforms added the military to groups that were pushing back. Above all, the reform process put local governments in a terrible squeeze. In short, the reform plan threatened the positions of every powerful interest group in China. The most dangerous position any leader can put himself in is to take on every powerful group at the same time. Somebody like Ataturk is very careful to have a coalition target this group, change the coalition, target another group. That's not the way it's being done in China. But Xi Jinping had a hammer to employ against folks who stood in his way, and that was the anti-corruption campaign. Not surprisingly, the first tiger brought down was Zhou Yongkang, the head of the petroleum faction, followed by very senior military leaders. But the broad application of the anti-corruption campaign also targeted every major power group in China. So Xi Jinping had doubled down on the political risk of getting everybody on the other side. In this context, Xi Jinping's team came to power thinking there was a coup plot underway, and the threat to so many power groups led to spectacular infighting. One top executive told me, "Bill, the atmosphere in Beijing is you die or I die." That's not the image we get on TV of the perfectly coiffed leader with all the identically clothed officials sitting behind. The reality was a really tough political struggle. Adding injury to injury, the anti-corruption campaign scared everybody, especially the people who were supposed to implement reform. If I'm a reformer and you're the person in charge of what's being reformed, you're going to say, he's corrupt. And in the Chinese context, I probably am, so I feel very vulnerable. So my reaction as an official is like a student that hasn't done his homework, hide in the back row and hope nobody sees me. So reform didn't happen very much. Because of this political warfare, Xi Jinping's first term was focused on subduing rivals. And that he did with spectacular success. All the rivals were eliminated. And the second term is supposed to be the term when reform gets done. And that started about a year ago. Thinking about that and thinking about the opposition, a lot of top officials started worrying, well, maybe we'll do these reforms and the next guy will roll them all back, like Trump rolling back everything Obama did. And maybe it'll be worse than that. Maybe there will be unpleasant reprisals against people who pushed these reforms. So I thought, well, we better allow the possibility of a third term. How is reform actually doing? Well, reform involves a lot of tough decisions. And in every case where it had to choose, I'm going to have my cake or I'm going to eat it. The choice has been, I'm going to have my cake and eat it too. They had a choice, fast reform and slow growth, or fast growth and slow reform. They said, we're going to have fast reform and we're going to have fast growth. The reality has been slow reform. They've said they'll move to market allocation of resources, but they're providing $1.7 trillion of subsidies to the big state enterprises. They've said they'll marketize the state enterprises, but in every state and private enterprise, they're trying to make sure that the party committee inside the enterprise has final say on all strategic business decisions. So you have a political figure second-guessing all strategic business decisions. They've said we'll create a level playing field, but they've emphasized consolidating national champions and making sure that things like competition policy only apply to foreign enterprises and not to the state enterprises. They've acknowledged that they need public input about corruption problems and environmental problems, but they're cracking down on almost every kind of public complaint. This determination to have the cake and eat it too is not Mao Zedong or Deng Xiaoping kind of decision making. It's much more Theresa May. But this decision isn't completely indecisive. In every area where the choice is market reform and efficiency or political control, the emphasis comes down on political control. So under Mao Zedong, it was politics in command. Under Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin, it was economics in command. Under Hu Jintao, it was patronage in command. Under Xi Jinping, it's politics mostly in command. And that has ominous implications for the economy. Recognition of this strategic indecision illuminates the role of Xi Jinping. Our media and many specialists describe Xi Jinping as the omnipotent president for life, as China's Putin. That's almost the exact opposite of reality. Xi is very powerful. He did eliminate his adversaries. He has a page-long list of titles and roles. He's enshrined in the Constitution. He's promoting movies and speeches that attribute China's successes to him and his father, and not so much to Deng Xiaoping. But the important test of a leader is, can he implement the agreed policy goals? Xi is hardly all-powerful in that dimension. He faces universal pushback, and his personal political priorities have overridden the economic tasks he was assigned. Therefore, he had limited economic success. Xi is not China's Putin. Xi is a creature of the Chinese Communist Party. He's an executive given a job and a set of tasks to do, and he's accountable to the leadership of the party. Putin's situation is the exact opposite. Putin's party is a creature of Putin. It exists solely to make Putin more powerful and richer. That difference is entirely in China's favor, but it's not a description of the omnipotent president for life. The sober reality is that Xi Jinping has a job to do, and he's not doing it. These consequences take a long time to ramify. Jeff Immelt presided over the decline of GE for 18 years, and China's a lot more complicated than GE. But the consequences do happen. Competent, confident executives do not accumulate all possible roles. Imagine the CEO of a really big enterprise who makes himself the operating director of every operating division. That wouldn't express competence and confidence. That would express fear of delegating. In contrast with this accumulation of roles, Deng Xiaoping governed China for years with one title: honorary chairman of the Chinese Bridge Players Society. At 80 years old, he gave a speech, and a few years later, 1 billion people were living different lives. That's real authority. Now I want to offer you two complementary perspectives. On the one hand, China faces very serious political problems. On the other hand, it's not facing some kind of great revolution. So let me start with the first. The lesson of the earlier Asian miracles is that the pressures of political complexity are inexorable. The current Chinese administration has chosen Park Chung-hee's strategy of sitting on the boiling political kettle and hoping the lid doesn't blow off. The result is a vicious circle of repression, pushback, more repression, more pushback. Beneath the surface, the political tides are shifting. Groups that strongly supported the administration 5 years ago are becoming alienated. 5 years ago, China was one of the few emerging countries where academics supported the government. They didn't like aspects of repression, but their view was, look at what this party and this government have done for the Chinese people. It's wonderful. So, some problems with repression, small price to pay. No more. China's professionals, journalists, lawyers, academics, the leading edge of society, today feel helpless but alienated. Of decisive importance is the business community. State enterprise leaders have lost about half their compensation. They're not happy about that. But the important sector is the private business sector. Virtually all job growth and economic growth come from China's private sector. Private sector investment has fallen by 2/3. Every private company is vulnerable to the local party secretary, who is still the arbiter of social equity. And so he calls up and says, I've got a great new project downtown. It's going to do a lot for the city. I need your $1 million by next Tuesday. Or usually unsaid, you're out of business. That causes a lot of resentment that doesn't appear in public. Now the government is worried about leverage of the whole society, and it's worried about corruption. So the local government is being told, you're not going to get the kind of resources you've been getting. And those innovative financial practices that have kept you funded, those aren't allowed anymore. Now, the local governments in China have outsized responsibility for social issues and undersized revenues. So they're feeling very squeezed. Now, what's going to happen? Now it's going to be, I've got 3 projects downtown and I need 3 contributions. And that's going to take a very serious toll. Add together the discontents of modern professions, local governments, powerful central party and government groups, state business, local business, and the most salient religious groups, and you have a tidal shift. The tides shift very gradually, but they shift. Western media and politicians look at all of Xi Jinping's titles. They see a stable dictator for life. That's not what the Chinese people see. In all this repression, they see fear. Fear as the motivator of all this repression. And they think, uh-oh, I better get my kids and my money out of China. It's been years since I've met an upper class or middle class family in China that didn't want to get its money out. There are probably some people in the audience here who are beneficiaries of that. This is the pressure for capital flight has created a necessity for powerful capital controls, and that's completely destroyed the move to make the Chinese currency a major international currency. Consistently, the politics undermines the economics. That's one side. Now I want to talk about system strength. This shift does not make China vulnerable to some kind of great revolution. The fundamentals of the governance system created by China's Communist Party are very sound, just like the Leninist predecessors in Taiwan and South Korea. But to understand this, one has to discard an awful lot of modern social science, Western social science thinking about how things actually work. Nothing highlights the malign influence of ideology and methodological fetishism in Western scholarship, like looking at the realities of China. Start with environmental issues. It was long a shibboleth of Western academic studies of China's environmental problems that because of the iniquitous Chinese communist system, China had the worst pollution problems in the world. On the contrary, when those studies were being published, the effect of air pollution on human health in India was already 11 times worse than in China. Chinese cities don't make the list of the top 100 most polluted cities in the world. Like London in 1950 and Japan in 1970, China just had to get to a certain threshold where people's basic needs were assured, and when environmental issues reached a point where it was, hey, we got to do something about this. Beijing's air pollution, nothing like London in the 1950s. And one day, coal dust in the air in London killed 2,000 healthy people. Doesn't happen in China. The reality is pretty much the opposite. Today, China spends more on environmental alleviation than the United States or all of Europe. It's the leader in every form of, it's the world leader in every form of green energy. They're digging out of a very deep hole, but they are really digging. Turn to economics. The leading development economists of our day, Acemoglu and Robinson, have shown persuasively that sustained economic development requires an inclusive society. And they make frequent derogatory comments about China because China is not politically inclusive. The assumption is that political inclusiveness and economic inclusiveness are the same. At this level of development, the exact opposite is the truth. In fact, these Asian miracle economies in their authoritarian periods specialize in creating inclusive economies. How do they do that? Well, they all start with taking the basic asset of what was then a peasant society, land, and having a great land reform. So everybody gets a piece of the action. And then they provide universal basic education. So everybody gets a chance. Something places like India have proven incapable so far of doing. And then they build infrastructure, very good infrastructure, to attract labor-intensive industry. And that labor-intensive industry, textiles, garments, computer assembly, radios, TVs, pulls everybody into the modern economy. For comparison, China builds about as many good roads in 6 months as India has built since independence in 1947. The most prominent beneficiaries of this labor-intensive industry is women, a particularly repressed group in traditional Chinese society. In most traditional agricultural societies, family survival can depend on muscle power. And that means a preference for boys over girls. That's not just China, it's everywhere, almost everywhere. In modern industry, making clothes, assembling computers, companies don't want boys, they want women. So you go to a typical factory and got 11 Taiwanese guys running the factory and 8,000 Chinese women. That's still unfair that it's 11 Taiwanese guys running the place, but the key social fact for China is those 8,000 Chinese women. Women travel 500, 1,000, 1,500 miles to get away from their villages and into these jobs. They get out from under the thumbs of their brothers and their fathers. They are the ones who are exposed to the modern world. They are the ones who develop a nest egg that can be used for a down payment on a home back in the village. I'll give you one indicator of the shift. In the old days, women had to provide a dowry. Today, guys, if you can't provide an apartment, she will not date you. That's a male dowry. Still a lot of gender unfairness in China, but the fundamental shift. Then these Asian miracle economies promote widespread home ownership. Highest rate of home ownership in the world is Singapore, 90%. Second highest is China, 85%. We Americans run about 64%. The number of Chinese families that own a home is about twice the number of Indian families that have access to a toilet. Now, modern Western economic theory says India is inclusive and China isn't. I leave it up to you. And then all these countries have an incredible property price inflation so that all these homes become more valuable. The average Chinese, we just heard a lecture at the Fairbanks Center yesterday, the average poor Chinese family has assets of 238,000 RMB. I call that $45,000. I haven't got the numbers for the US, but I think the numbers for the US are a lot lower. So what does all this mean? For the economy, first, growth, while still relatively high on world terms, has been declining for years, and it will continue to decline. Actual growth is a lot less than published growth. Growth is being sustained by unproductive investment, and paid for by rapidly increasing debt. Political officials are being given final say over strategic business decisions in all companies. China won't have a great financial crisis. It's going to have more and more sand in the gears. Slower, slower, slower. The emphasis on subsidies and protections for the big companies is so reminiscent of Japan. This is how you slide in. You reduce competition and slide into stagnation. And China is taking a turn in the direction of inward. Again, a comparison with Japan, I think, is crucial. In 1965, Japan's mentality was like China's up until a few years ago. We're going to seek out best practice everywhere in the world and bring it back. We're going to be super globalizers. And then 1975, the mentality was our superior growth is due to our superior Japanese cultural traditions. And we're going to keep our students home, and we're going to take care of our own big companies, not just at the expense of foreigners, but the expense of up and coming local companies. This combination of focus on protecting big companies and turning away from globalization is the core of Japanese stagnation. Couple indicators. Well, China's economy is still much more open and competitive than Japan's. We always have to remember that. The shift is quite dramatic. 5 years ago, if a Chinese official or academic spent some time at Harvard, that was almost an automatic guarantee of rapid promotion and good treatment. Now it's a guarantee of questions about loyalty. Xi Jinping speaks eloquently about reform and opening, but the reality is backsliding and closing. In the Cultural Revolution, there was a phrase for this. It's called waving the red flag to defeat the red flag. This risks Japanese-style stagnation. This is what Xi Jinping was hired to prevent. It's the most likely result of his policies so far. Finally, and I'll close with this. China faces a very fundamental political problem, one that's not much mentioned in Western commentary, and that's a shift from a vanguard party to an interest group. China's early reformers took extraordinary political risks to make the economy work. When Deng Xiaoping took power, the core of communist power was the ability through the communes to control the life of every person. Most people were peasants. The communes gave the leaders control over your job, where that job was, who you married, what you wore, what kind of haircut you had, everything. But Deng Xiaoping saw in Anhui province, some of the peasants started taking back the land, completely against communist policy. But Deng Xiaoping saw, hey, local economy's starting to grow very fast, and the peasants seem pretty happy. Maybe we should not just tolerate this, maybe we should spread it everywhere. When we look back through an economic lens, that seems like the most obvious decision imaginable. If you stand in Deng Xiaoping's shoes and look forward, That was the most risky political decision he could possibly take. And later, Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji did the same thing in the cities. Huge political risk in order to deliver benefits to the people. That kind of behavior, taking huge risks in order to deliver benefits, hoping that those benefits will then make you popular and consolidate your power. That's what a vanguard party does. What would be the counterparts today? The counterparts would be for the party to step back from direct control of the state enterprises, for the party to step back from direct control of the courts. The economic benefits and the sense of justice would be enormously good for the population. But today the emphasis is control of every lever of power, however small. That transforms the Communist Party from a vanguard party into an interest group. Consciousness that the parties claim to be a vanguard, this claim to become a vanguard has become hollow, will spread very gradually. But it makes Xi Jinping the Mitch McConnell of the Communist Party. There are consequences eventually. So what does this all mean for the future? China does not risk sudden financial or political collapse. Its problem is a gradual accumulation of political and economic sand in the gears. Resistance to policies that undermine the economy and undermine political legitimacy is gathering force very gradually. Almost nobody acts because almost everybody is afraid. But famous professors do speak out, knowing they'll lose their jobs. And kids at Beida go and help workers organize for better wages, knowing that they'll be put in jail. They call themselves Marxist societies when they do this. Local officials, in one case, ignored direct orders from Xi Jinping 6 times in a row when he told them to stop illegal environment damaging activities in a national reserve. Millions of families quietly try to get their kids and their money out of China. The Chinese society today reminds me a little bit of the supersaturated liquids we all studied in high school chemistry. You hold up the glass and it looks clear, but you go tap, 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 and a lot of white stuff precipitates out. I don't know when the tap, tap, tap will come. I don't know what will precipitate out. What I can predict is that things will get a lot better or they'll get a lot worse. They can't remain the same.